a good feeling.
Right. For most of us, it's just a minor annoyance. We silence it, we move on with our day. But for about 70 million Americans every single year, that ringing triggers a very specific, visceral anxiety. It is the debt collector. The daily reality for these consumers isn't just a phone call. It's this invisible machine of repeated contact, the profound confusion of navigating complex billing systems, and the frustration of dealing with a market where you just feel entirely powerless.
Yeah, it's a landscape that is fundamentally imbalanced. You've got human anxiety being, bought and sold on spreadsheets. But that anxiety is precisely why this market is heavily scrutinized. I mean, nobody wants to see consumers harassed.
Absolutely.
Own staggering labyrinth. We have built an administrative architecture so incredibly complex that even well-intentioned financial actors, people trying to legitimately recover owed funds, they struggle to navigate it without stepping on a compliance landmine. The rules have basically become a trap.
Which brings us to the monumental shift we really need to discuss today. For years, the agency responsible for policing this space, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, has been under existential threat. People tried to kill the agency entirely.
Right, by attacking how it gets its money.
Exactly. But just recently, the Supreme Court, in a decisive 7-2 ruling, upheld the CFPB's unique funding structure. They draw capped funds directly from the Federal Reserve, and the court ruled that this satisfies the Constitution. So with that threat gone, the agency's director declared that the CFPB is now, quote, firing on all cylinders.
It certainly is. I mean, they're reviving vacated rules, the regulatory engine is roaring back to life, and that fundamentally alters the risk calculus for any business involved in credit.
It does, and that sets up our central question for today. Does the CFPB's newly affirmed regulatory power, specifically its strict liability enforcement of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, represent a necessary, robust shield for consumers, or does it create an overly rigid framework that unfairly penalizes debt collectors for the systemic complexities of modern credit?
Right.
I will argue that the CFPB's strict enforcement is absolutely essential. It corrects a severe power imbalance and protects vulnerable consumers from unsubstantiated claims in a market that simply will not police itself.
And I'll be arguing that applying strict liability to inherently uncertain markets and attempting to micromanage literally every communication creates a punitive, dysfunctional regulatory trap, one that ultimately raises the cost of credit for everyone.
Well, let's start with why this aggressive posture is even necessary. The CFPB was born out of the 2008 financial crisis, designed to be the indispensable enforcer of the FDCPA. Without this agency, consumer protection is dangerously weak. It would just rely on individuals fighting massive corporations in court.
Sure, but the strict rules?
The strict rules are a feature, not a bug. They establish foundational protections. Take the validation notice, for example. When a collector contacts you, they have exactly 5 days to send you written details.
Right, the amount and the original creditor.
Yes, and then you have 30 days to contest it in writing. If you do, the collection has to completely stop until the debt is actually proven. That is power returned to the consumer.
Well, I mean, the objective boundaries make sense on paper, I'll give you that.
Right, like strict calling hours. They can only call between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. in your local time zone. If they call outside that, it's a violation. And if you say, I can't take calls at work, they legally have to stop calling your workplace.
Yes, and protecting consumers from genuine harassment, obscene language, threats of violence, or calling someone's office 20 times a day, that is universally supported. Nobody argues abusive practices should be tolerated. We also agree on the third-party rules.
Right, they can't discuss your debt with your neighbors or your boss.
Exactly. They can only contact third parties to get basic contact info, like an address. And if they already have your phone number, they shouldn't be calling your family.
But the CFPB's current administrative architecture profoundly overreaches. The core issue here is interpreting the FDCPA as a strict liability statute.
Why is that an overreach? Let's pause on strict liability for a second. For the listener, strict liability basically means intent doesn't matter. It is like a speeding ticket. It doesn't matter if your speedometer was broken or if you were rushing to the hospital. If you're over the limit, you are liable. Applying that absolute standard to highly complex arenas like medical debt completely ignores the practical realities of the industry. You're demanding perfect data integrity from secondary actors in a primary market that is fundamentally flawed.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective, especially on medical debt. This is perhaps the most glaring example of why strict liability is necessary. The CFPB recently reminded debt collectors they must have a, quote, reasonable basis to assert a debt's validity.
Right, but what is reasonable in medical billing?
Well, collectors routinely attempt to collect amounts prohibited by the No Surprises Act, or amounts that violate a hospital's own financial assistance policies. Let me offer an analogy. Just as a manufacturer is strictly liable for a defective product, a debt buyer who purchases portfolios for pennies on the dollar must be strictly liable for the data integrity of the debts they collect. If they collect an amount the consumer isn't legally obligated to pay, they falsely represented the debt. Strict liability forces them to do the diligence up front.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Your defective product analogy assumes the debt collector controls the manufacturing of the debt, which they absolutely do not.
But they choose to buy it.
Sure, but let's look at how the secondary debt market actually works. It's essentially a high-stakes game of telephone. The hospital's billing department generates a code. That gets run through an insurance provider who might claw back a payment 6 months later, or the hospital applies a retroactive financial aid adjustment. The CFPB itself acknowledges the inherently uncertain nature of medical billing. Holding a third-party debt collector strictly liable for a hospital's internal, retroactive adjustments is just intellectually dishonest.
But if the data is that degraded, why should the collector be allowed to pursue it at all?
Because the legal statute itself, the FDCPA, differentiates between intentional and unintentional violations. It has a bona fide error defense. Yet the strict liability standard treats every single clerical mismatch, a missing dollar sign, a trailing decimal, a misapplied hospital credit, as an illegal misrepresentation. If a collector relies on a hospital's representation and the hospital changes the math without telling them, the collector is suddenly liable for a federal violation. It creates this massive chilling effect.
I hear the argument about the telephone game, I do. But that imperfection is exactly why the burden must fall on the sophisticated financial actor, not the consumer. The consumer has zero visibility into the hospital's billing department, let alone the debt buyer's spreadsheet. If you buy 10,000 medical debts for 2 cents on the dollar and the portfolio lacks proper substantiation, you shouldn't collect on it. It really is that simple. If the data is bad, change the business model, not the consumer's rights.
But you're assuming the business model is inherently predatory, rather than simply operating in a complex ecosystem. When you weaponize a statute against clerical errors, you stifle the whole financial ecosystem. The cost of endless compliance and defending against trivial lawsuits, that gets passed down to consumers as higher interest rates.
Well, let's look at how these boundaries actually operate in practice, because it's not just about clerical errors. This brings us to Regulation F, the rule the CFPB finalized to modernize the FDCPA. Take the mechanism of debt parking.
Right, the passive collection strategy.
Exactly. Debt parking is this coercive practice where a collector places a negative mark on your credit report without ever trying to contact you. You only find out about the debt when you apply for a mortgage, your credit score is tanked, and you pay it, even if it's invalid, just to get approved.
Yeah, that's a tough situation.
It is. And under Reg F, the CFPB explicitly outlawed it. A collector cannot furnish info to a credit bureau until they've spoken to you or sent a letter and waited 14 days. We also have rules against threatening to sue on time-barred debt or threatening to garnish wages if the statute of limitations is expired. And crucially, Regulation F establishes a strict 7-call-per-week limit. That is a clear, objective boundary against harassment.
That's an interesting point about objective boundaries. But I'd frame it differently. When you look closely at Reg F, it reveals the hyper-technical absurdity of micromanaging human communication. Let's take the limited content message paradox.
You mean the voicemail rule?
Right. The CFPB tweeted this to solve a real problem. How does a collector leave a voicemail without violating the rule against disclosing a debt to a third party, like a roommate who might hear it? So they engineered the limited content message. The collector has to state their name, request a reply, and leave a number. But, and this is the kicker, they absolutely cannot indicate that they are in the debt collection business.
To protect the consumer's privacy.
Sure, but what does that sound like in practice? Hi, this is John Smith. Please Please call me back at this number. It sounds exactly like a phishing scam. It forces legitimate businesses to intentionally sound suspicious, which creates intense consumer confusion.
I understand the friction there. I grant that a vague voicemail isn't ideal. But consider the alternative. A collector leaves a detailed voicemail about your severe financial distress and your employer hears it. The privacy violation there is catastrophic. The vague voicemail is a necessary compromise to protect privacy while allowing the business to attempt contact.
Okay, but let's look at your other example, the 7-call limit. You called it an objective boundary against harassment, but in practice, it's an arbitrary blunt instrument because it applies per debt, not per consumer.
Right, the multiplier effect.
Yeah, it's a massive loophole. If a consumer has 3 separate medical bills from the same hospital with one agency, that agency can legally call 21 times in a single week. Conversely, if you have one account calling an 8th time, even if the consumer asks them to call back and the line dropped, is an automatic strict liability violation. It completely fails to measure harassment contextually.
I'm not convinced by that. Because defining harassment contextually relies entirely on subjective interpretation. And historically, subjective interpretation in financial markets has never favored the consumer. When we leave it to the collector to define what's reasonable, the boundaries expand until abuse is normalized. Objective rules give both sides clear rules of engagement. And this brings us to the broader implications of the CFPB's renewed mandate.
The firing on all cylinders era.
Precisely. The Supreme Court affirmed their funding, so their market integrity mission is preserved. They can operate independently to tackle systemic issues and dispel dangerous consumer myths.
What kind of myths?
Well, for example, many consumers falsely believe that simply asking a collector to stop calling magically erases the debt. It doesn't. It just stops the communication. Or they think original creditors follow the exact same FDCPA rules, when the law mainly applies to third-party collectors.
Right. Or the myth that their wages can just be garnished at will.
Exactly, when in reality, wage garnishment requires a formal court order, and certain income, like Social Security, is protected. With secure funding, the CFPB can crack down on junk fees and enforce the FDCPA through actual lawsuits. It empowers consumers to sue for $1,000 in statutory damages plus real damages. It democratizes accountability.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the unintended systemic consequences of this emboldened approach? The agency's rhetoric signals a dangerous shift toward regulation by enforcement. Look at how they define when a debt is actually in default. They insist default must be defined by objective state contract law, rather than the subjective intent of the creditor.
Which makes perfect sense. A consumer needs to know exactly where they stand based on the black and white contract they signed, not some secret, unpublished internal policy.
But consider the systemic effect of that rigidity. Say a hospital bill says due on receipt in the fine print, but in practice, the hospital gives patients a 6-month informal grace period before sending it to collections. Applying strict state contract law means the debt defaults on day 2. If the hospital transfers it to a servicer on day 30 just to manage billing, that servicer is now legally a debt collector subject to the entire crushing weight of the FDCPA.
Right.
What happens next? Creditors realize the risk is too high. They strip necessary flexibility from their relationships. They write much more rigid loan terms. They stop offering informal grace periods entirely because regulatory certainty demands strict adherence to the contract. The CFPB's insistence on rigid standards actually destroys the informal leniency that benefits struggling consumers.
I would argue that informal leniency is often just a mask for arbitrary enforcement. If a creditor wants to offer a 6-month grace period, they should explicitly write it into the contract so the consumer has a legal right to it. Transparency is always better than opacity. Without the CFPB robustly backing these frameworks, the high-volume, automated nature of modern debt collection would just steamroll the average citizen. A well-funded CFPB enforcing strict liability is the only effective counterbalance to an industry built on asymmetric information.
And I maintain that while stopping genuinely abusive practices is an absolute necessity, weaponizing statutes like the FDCPA against procedural footfalls in inherently complex markets is deeply counterproductive. It creates a system of gotcha litigation when a financial institution has to spend millions defending against class action lawsuits over whether a vague voicemail was technically a communication. Those costs don't just vanish. They're passed down as higher interest rates and restricted access to credit.
Well, despite our fundamentally different philosophies on the mechanics of regulation, I think we have arrived at several crucial points of convergence today. We both entirely agree that consumers absolutely have rights under the FDCPA.
Yes, and that preventing harassment is non-negotiable.
Right. We also clearly agree on the practical reality for anyone navigating the system. Documenting interactions is absolutely critical. Because the market operates on data, consumers must keep their own. Logging dates, times, the specific phrases used by collectors, their names, and sending disputes in writing, these are essential steps.
Absolutely. Submitting complaints to the CFPB and the FTC if your rights are violated is key. Whether you view the CFPB's regulations as a vital shield or a hyper-technical trap, the reality on the ground is that precise communication is always better than ambiguity. Knowing your rights is the absolute best defense in a complex financial ecosystem.
It is deeply valuable to examine these frameworks from both the consumer protection angle and the systemic market compliance angle. I highly suggest that our listeners explore the actual texts of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and Regulation F. Understanding the raw mechanics of these laws is the best way to grasp your rights.
The balance of power in our financial system is constantly shifting, and the Supreme Court's recent decision ensures the CFPB will remain a dominant, well-funded force. But the ultimate conclusion on whether that immense power is wielded effectively or whether it simply creates friction, well, that's one every listener will have to determine for themselves.
So the next time you hear that phone ring and you see an unknown number, remember, the landscape behind that call is murky, and the machine driving it is complex. But you have rights, and the rules governing that call have never been more intensely debated. Thank you for joining us.